The Battle of the Somme began on the 1st of July 1916 and was one of the defining engagements of the First World War. It was the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army, with over 56,000 casualties and almost 20,000 dead. Present that day were 9 battalions, including the Manchester Pals of the Manchester Regiment. On that infamous first day, a Pal named Albert Andrews wrote in his diary,
Saturday, July 1st. As soon as we got on the road, we saw an awful sight, for there was wounded men by hundreds coming from the line. Then the order came down. Dump everything and fix bayonets. You have got to fight for it, lads. We obeyed the order like men. I know we have had a lot of lads wounded, and I had not seen anything of Charlie, my pal, since. Saturday, July 2nd. I asked about my pal and they told me they was afraid he had been killed. But I went and lifted the oil sheet from over his face and found that it was Harold Beecher. I was very sorry, for we had lost being good chums from the day we had arrived in France. Tuesday, July 4th. Made some tea and had something to eat for the first time since Saturday morning. We was fairly quiet from the Wednesday to Friday tea time. Then Fritz started shelling us again. I was talking to these 3 men some 10 yards away and a shell dropped and killed all of them. It was an awful sight.
Well, we raced up and down that trench until every man was done up, for we kept getting the orders about turn, double out and then advance. We hadn't gone far up the trench before we came across 3 of our own lads lying dead. Their heads been badly damaged by a shell. Their names were Voice and Webster's brothers.
July 1st, at 7:30 AM on a beautiful sunny morning, off we started. About 50 yards between each wave. I was carrying my rifle by the sling on my shoulder with the bayonet parallel to my ear. I had not gone many yards when, whiz, I felt as if someone had pulled at the top. However, I took no notice as we were at a time to keep going. Like nearly every other fellow, I was smoking. No man's land was one mass of shell holes. The soil was loose and we had 400 yards of this to go to the first German trench. Fritz let us have it with shrapnel, machine guns and rifles. As we travelled along, our lads kept falling, killed and wounded. And about halfway across, the second wave catches up with the first to fill these gaps. About 100 yards from the German trench, our officer turned up and said, "Up a bit on the left," then pitch forwards. That was the last ever order he gave.
During the war, 10,000 Pals were recruited from the same towns and villages, serving alongside friends and family. And it was these communities that mourned their absence, as 5,000 Pals never returned home. The northwest of England was the heartland of recruitment and also the centre of the industrial war effort. Many of the region's companies converted to produce munitions for the war effort. Heaton Park was transformed into the major military training ground for the Manchester Regiment before going to France to fight at the Somme. Thousands of recruits lived in a tent city in the park while they trained to become soldiers. They dug trenches and practiced manoeuvres with bayonets. The Manchester Pals left Heaton Park in April 1915 for further training and ultimately the destination of the Somme. But the park continued to be used as a space for healing the wounded. Temporary structures were turned into hospital wards. Orthopaedist Major Tate Mackenzie trialled experimental treatments there, such as hydrotherapy and whirlpool baths for wounds. The park was also a site for local amusement. The wounded even made display trenches, listening posts, and dug fake shell holes as a local attraction. Paying visitors flocked to the park, and proceeds went to the war blind.
Heaton Park is certainly an important site in terms of the history of the First World War, particularly around Manchester, because of the whole association with the Manchester Pals. This is the place where so many of them trained before they went off to fight, and also tying this in with the centenary of the Battle of the Somme in 2016. That the fact that this will be, Heaton Park will be a place where there'll be a concert and other events to commemorate this event. It's an important focal point there, and certainly an important place in the area.
Total war had engaged the entire community of Manchester and its regions. Men, women, children were all engulfed by the war. The University of Manchester has a large memorial to its pupils and staff who fought and died during the war. 626 men and 1 woman, who were all members of the university community, died during their service in the war. It was unveiled on the 29th of November 1924, commemorating the sacrifice that the staff and students of the university had made.
The impact of the First World War on the University of Manchester, you can look at this in 2 different areas. One is the impact it had on the institution in terms of disciplines and subjects. Some departments closed entirely during the war, places such as law. Some departments continued, history and various other things still continued during the war, even with fewer students. The other side of it is the impact with the student community. A large number of students went off to fight. Staff as well went off to fight. Quite a few died during the war, and this is reflected on the university's war memorial, which is in the main quad.
Britain's memorial landscape was once reserved for the members of the upper-class elite who had led entire armies into battle to die. The First World War altered the course of the memorialisation in both Manchester and the nation as a whole. The names of men from all walks of life were enshrined on monuments, revealing the shift in the focus of remembrance to ordinary people. But in 1924, it was Edwin Lutyens' Manchester cenotaph that became the heart of remembrance. Taking inspiration from classical Greek architecture, Lutyens took a minimalist approach to the design. Despite the mass death and destruction of the war, it conveyed the strength and continuity of Western civilization. The only gesture to the reality of death is a lone soldier lying flat, covered by his greatcoat. Seen only at a distance 42 feet from the ground, this single figure stands for all of Manchester's dead servicemen. The city of Manchester has extensively memorialised the men it lost. From the central cenotaph to local memorials, and now Heaton Park, the war and its memories are being relived in the city.